And our recording is just of our speakers today, so we shouldn't have any girls' faces being or names being recorded. So thank you everybody so much for joining us. My name is Amy and I am the Community Partnerships Manager for Girl Scouts of Colorado. I want to thank all of you so much for taking the time to join us this afternoon and give special thanks to our co-host today, Ranger Denise, who's with the Women's Rights National Historic Park in Seneca Falls, New York. So we'll welcome her a little bit later on. I just want to first take care of a few housekeeping items. So right now, we are going to keep everybody on mute for the duration of our session today. If you have any trouble connecting or any audio issues or anything like that, you can always enter it into the chat box. Our chat box is currently closed except to the host only. So anything that you put in there, only I can see at the moment. We will open everything up for questions for Ranger Denise, and at that time we'll open the chat box up for everybody. So just keep a listen out and we will open the chat box later. Please keep everything appropriate today. We have Girl Scouts from across Colorado and actually Girl Scouts from even outside of Colorado listening. We also have Girl Scouts from daisies up through ambassadors. So please, any questions that you're asking, please just recognize that we have Girl Scouts of all ages, so please keep things appropriate. And I think we should go ahead and get started. So first off, like I said, welcome. And as we get started, I think we should kick everything off with the Girl Scout promise and law. So please join me from home as we start off with the promise. So, on my honor, I will try to serve God and my country, to help people at all times, and to live by the Girl Scout law. Now, of course, the Girl Scout law. I will do my best to be honest and fair, friendly and helpful, considerate and caring, courageous and strong, and responsible for what I say and do, and to respect myself and others, respect authority, use resources wisely, make the world a better place, and be a sister to every Girl Scout. All right. Thank you so much. Before I really turn things over to Ranger Denise, I just want to point out two things. So on this title slide here, we have two Girl Scout patches that you can earn. One is the Girl Scout 19th Amendment Centennial Ranger patch. And you can get this patch. You have to go directly to a national park that you're working with, and they can distribute those patches. And then here is the new patch directly from Girl Scouts of the USA, and you can get that patch. You can order it online through the GSUSA shop. So I will make sure to put some links to that information in the chat box at the end of our session today. But I'm really excited to turn things over to Ranger Denise, who is with the Women's Rights National Historic Park in Seneca Falls, New York. So let me unmute her. Welcome, Ranger Denise. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here with all of you, all the way from New York. It's pretty exciting. We're very excited about this new Amendment Centennial patch too. So
I'm so excited about this. I've already learned so much about the women's suffrage centennial and the women's right to vote, but I'm definitely excited to learn some more from you today. So please take it away.
Okay. Well, so we are going to talk today about, let me start sharing my screen here. Oh, here we go. Come on. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to also shut off my video. So I'm not doing both.
It looks great.
I'm sorry?
Looks great.
Oh, good. Okay, fantastic. So, so again, my name is Lucille. I am a park ranger at Women's Rights National Historical Park here in Seneca Falls, New York, and I want to say, okay, there we go. To say welcome to Women's Rights National Historical Park. So even though you're not physically here with us, you are here with us in spirit and in learning, and we know how important that is. So these are the the resources that Women's Rights National Historical Park is here to present and interpret and preserve. So it is our job to preserve and protect for all the generations to come what we like to call our nation's collective story. And Women's Rights National Historical Park is responsible for telling the story of the 1848 Women's Rights Convention. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the convention itself. We're going to talk about the women and men who made that convention happen. And I will leave you a little bit after the 1840s or 1850s. And then I really encourage you all to learn more about the women's rights movement and how it progressed after the early era and the early times in Seneca Falls. So if you have any questions, when we get to the Q&A, it'll be about a half hour. When we get to the Q&A, I would encourage you all to ask any and all questions that you might have. I love the interactive part of doing these virtual sessions because it really feels like we're all, in the chapel, in the Wesleyan Chapel together. The Wesleyan Chapel is that building up on the left there with a view of it from up the stairs. And then to the right of the Wesleyan Chapel is actually the side wall of our visitor center. And there is what we call a water wall. So it's an art feature. It has all of the Declaration of Sentiments, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, written on this wall, and the water flows over it. And then just below the water wall are two houses that we share the stories of. The one on the left is the McClintock house, where the McClintock family lived in the 1830s and 1840s. And the white one on the right is the Elizabeth Cady Stanton home right here in Seneca Falls. And that is the home of Elizabeth Cady Stanton from 1846, 47-ish through 1862. And that is where she lived. And we're going to talk a little bit about her. So I just want to give a little bit of a excuse. So if you hear my dog barking, I apologize. I am at home, just like the rest of you are. So if she does bark, I really do apologize. Her name is Martha, and she's named after someone that we're going to talk about. So, so let's get going. All right. So seems kind of funny that I'm going to start this whole conversation about Women's Rights National Historical Park by talking about a man, right? But that's what I'm going to do. So Richard Hunt, in the early 1800s, so like the 1820s to the 1850s, Richard Hunt is probably the wealthiest man in the Waterloo, Seneca Falls area. He is the first person to do what we would consider today, we would call today commercially develop this area. So what that means is that he built up all kinds of businesses. He built lots of factories and mills along the river and the canal here. He enticed a lot of his really wealthy friends from all over New York and Pennsylvania and Massachusetts to come here and invest their money in this area. He really believed that this was going to be, or that this could be a big industrial business area. And he wasn't really wrong. So I want to tell you a little bit about why I have this picture of this gentleman on the right, William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison is the most important, one of the most important abolitionists or anti-slavery men in our nation at the time. And he is the author of a newspaper called The Liberator. And The Liberator only publishes stories about enslaved people and their escapes to freedom, and also how to make that happen. And you guys probably know a lot of those stories through known through as the Underground Railroad. So William Lloyd Garrison worked to raise a lot of money to make that happen. And Richard Hunt and William Lloyd Garrison are pretty good friends. And Richard Hunt sends William Lloyd Garrison 5 yards of wool in 1840. And he sends it from his woolen mills right here in Waterloo, which is right next door to Seneca Falls. And William Lloyd Garrison has a suit made with that 5 yards, and he wears that suit to the World Anti-Slavery Society meeting, which is held in London, England in 1840. There's 2 reasons that this is important. One is because in 1840, a lot of mill towns in the Northeast actually are milling cotton. So they're making cotton cloth and not wool cloth. The reason Richard Hunt decides to create wool cloth instead of cotton cloth is because cotton is a commodity that is produced from the labor of enslaved people. And Richard Hunt does not believe in slavery. He believes that slavery is, in his words, an abomination to humankind and should not exist. And William Lloyd Garrison believes the same. So remember when I said that Richard Hunt asked a lot of his really rich friends to invest into Seneca Falls and Waterloo area and to come here and to start businesses? Well, one of those people is Daniel Cady. And Daniel Cady is Elizabeth Cady Stanton's father. And so he comes here. He doesn't actually move here and live here, but he buys some property and he invests in some of Richard Hunt's businesses. So William Lloyd Garrison wears that suit to the World Anti-Slavery Society meeting that I told you about in London in 1840. And at that World Anti-Slavery Society meeting is Lucretia Mott and her husband James, who were invited to London to speak at that convention, at that meeting, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is there with her husband Henry, and they're on their honeymoon. For the first day and a half of the 3-day convention, instead of talking about, you know, how we're going to fix this problem in the world of slavery, the only thing that the leaders of this meeting talk about is whether or not they're going to let women speak. After a whole day, they decided they would let women stay. And then it took another half a day before they decided that they would let them stay, but they wouldn't let them speak. And they made them sit in the balcony and be quiet. These 2 women were not very fond of that decision. And they sat side by side for the next day and a half and, you know, kind of complained to each other about the fact that Lucretia Mott in 1840, who is one of our nation's most important anti-slavery people, can't even speak to this really important topic. She can't even speak. They're not even allowing her to speak. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who grows up in a pretty privileged family, as you know, her dad is pretty wealthy, right? She's just irate. And so they decide in that moment that when they get back to the United States, they are going to hold a meeting just like this, but it's going to be only about women's rights and the status of women in society. So what can women do? What can't women do? All those things. Lucretia Mott is born on the island of Nantucket in Massachusetts. And she is raised in a fairly wealthy Quaker family, not like stinking wealthy, but, pretty well off, a pretty well off Quaker family. And then she attends boarding school in New York, where she meets James. But while she's studying at this Quaker boarding school, she kind of discovers a few things about the world, as most of us do when we're in adolescence, right? She discovers that and comes to believe that slavery is barbaric. She thinks that it is the most appalling thing that one person can do to another. And certainly now it's happening, and it's acceptable by the whole nation, essentially, by the government of the nation. And she completely disagrees with that. The other thing she discovers is that women are treated much differently than men. Lucretia Mott, she meets James at this school. He is a teacher there, and she becomes a teacher there. She's like an assistant teacher, and he's a teacher, and she becomes a teacher. They get married when she's 19, and they have 5 children, and they move to Philadelphia a few years later because her mom moves there. We'll talk about her mom in a little bit. Just a little bit more about Lucretia Mott. So Lucretia Mott was invited in 1833 with her husband to the first American Anti-Slavery Society meeting, and also to the first New England Anti-Slavery Society meeting. And when she comes home from those meetings in 1833, she comes back to Philadelphia, and she starts, within a few days, she starts what we know as the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. The reason I like to talk about this is for 2 reasons. One is that Lucretia Mott and Marianne McClellan, who is another woman we're going to talk about, are both founding members of that anti-slavery society. But it's also really important because the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society is the first women's only political organization in our nation. So it's the first time that a group of women came together for women to talk about kind of political issues. And in this instance, it was about slavery or anti-slavery. Lucretia Mott was also the founder of the Association for the Relief and Employment of Poor Women, which was an organization that taught women it taught women skills that they needed, but it taught women skills that they needed so that they could be financially independent if something happened to their husbands or their fathers or their brothers, because they were not allowed in any way to have any control over their own money. They weren't allowed to own property. They weren't allowed to keep their own wages. So she wanted to make sure that women who were left alone in the world had both the skills and the ideas of survival. So that's really what she wanted. Marianne McClellan, who I just mentioned, was also one of the starters of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. She and her husband, Thomas McClellan, came to Waterloo in the 1830s. And like I said, she was a founding member of that. that society. So she comes here, and what do you think she does here, right? She becomes a founding member of the Western New York Anti-Slavery Society. So she is really busy. Marianne and Thomas McClintock run this house as part of the Underground Railroad. Another thing that they do, they have two grown daughters who run a school for girls on the second floor of this house right here. And also Thomas and Marianne run stores. So they have two stores in Waterloo that are owned by Richard Hunt, who is related to Thomas McClintock. And they're like cousins. And so Marianne and Thomas run these stores, and they also run schools for girls above the stores. So you can kind of see this pattern here, right, about how important education is to them, and also how important education for girls is to them. We talked a little bit about how Richard Hunt didn't believe in using the products that was created by the really hard work of enslaved people and people who were held in bondage. And Thomas and Marianne believed the same thing. They did not sell anything in their stores that was created with the labor of enslaved people, that hard-working people had to do under the threat of a whip and for no gain of their own. So, and Thomas and Marianne actually started an organization when they were still living in Philadelphia. They started an organization called the Free Produce Society, and that Free Produce Society, everybody who kind of joined that really spread the word about that, about only using and selling products that were created with free labor, where people are paid. So one of the really important things to note here is that between Marianne McClintock and Lucretia Mott, who we just talked about, they are founding members of 4 of the 5, so 3 for sure, 3 of the 5 largest anti-slavery societies in our country. So these are women who know how to organize things, right? They know how to, get their word out. They know how to share information. So all that stuff, these 2 women know how to do, and they know how to do it pretty well. Jane Hunt comes to Waterloo in the late 1840s, like 1846, 1847, and marries Richard Hunt. And Jane Hunt is from Philadelphia, and she is a Quaker. And her father is Masters is his last name, and her mother's last name is Clothier. And these are 2 of the wealthiest families in Philadelphia, who own some of the biggest businesses there. And one of the things that Jane does as a young woman and as a girl is she learns as much as she can about those businesses from her father and her grandfathers. So she's really interested in this business, and she kind of sticks around in the office, maybe when she's probably not supposed to. But the one good thing about this, the 2 good things about this, is she was kind of able to sit around in their offices and learn at their feet, because they probably, this is the bad part, they probably didn't think she was learning anything. They probably thought she was just there playing with her dolls and doing some of her stitching, but really what she was doing is she was really listening, and she kept diaries, and she would write about the things that she learned about business. And so she comes to Seneca Falls, Waterloo, with all this business experience, right? And really understanding how businesses work, but really having no place to share it, because women aren't allowed in business really at this point. Jane Hunt, I kind of feel like Jane Hunt is a lot like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So remember we talked about how her dad was rich and Jane's dad was rich, and you know, Elizabeth moves here from Boston and Jane moves here from Philadelphia, and you know, they really both like the life that they had, and they're both pretty kind of outspoken women, you know, so so I kind of like that about both of them. Martha Coffin Wright is here on the left, is the one that my dog is named after. And we love Martha. Martha is one of the most tenacious, tough young women, really, in our history. And a lot of people don't even know who she is, right? So Martha Coffin Wright is the younger sister, the much younger sister of Lucretia Mott, who we already talked about. So Martha is born in Boston, almost 20 years after Lucretia. I think there's like 16 years between them. So she's born in Boston, and not long after, when she's a young girl, unfortunately, her dad passes away. And so her mom moves them from Boston to Philadelphia, and she opens a boarding house and a store. This is that period when Lucretia is married now at this point, and she and James moved back to Philadelphia to help run the store with her mother. So their mother's name is Anna Coffin. And Anna Coffin, when her husband dies, she has, so remember how I said women didn't have any rights to their own money that they earned? Well, she didn't. And Anna Coffin did not have any rights to her money, but what she did have to do was pay back all of the debt that her husband had incurred while he was alive. So she can't even make her own money in her life as a married woman, but she is still responsible as a widow when her husband dies to pay all that money back. So Martha, as a young woman, you know, she's coming up through adolescence, and this is what she's learning, right? She's learning about this woman, her mom, Anna, who is just so hardworking and so determined to pay off this debt that she does. Anna pays it off, and she pays it off, you know, pretty quickly. Martha meets the first man that she's going to marry, Peter, who is a soldier, and he's been injured, and he stays in their boarding house. And so once he's all healed, she's much younger than him. He's like a lot older than her. And then once he's all healed, they get married, and he gets his orders to go to Florida, to what is called an outpost. So he has to go to a fort in Florida. And so she goes with him, and they have a little baby. Her name is Marina. And then her husband, Peter, passes away. And so Martha has to make her way back up north, and her mother at this point is now living in New York, right in this area near Seneca Falls. And so she has to make her way back to Seneca Falls, all the way back from Florida with her baby. She's 19 years old, and she now has an infant, and she has to come back to New York. And so she gets on this boat finally, and then there's a big storm, and the boat capsizes, or you know, there's a big shipwreck. And not only does she save herself and her daughter, her baby daughter, but she saves other people on the ship as well. So now they're kind of stuck on the East Coast in Georgia or South Carolina, waiting for another ship to come along and take them and all their stuff back north. So finally she gets up here after it takes almost a year, almost a whole year for her to get back up here. And she gets here, and she starts teaching at the same school that her mom's teaching at. And she marries her second husband, and you know, they have like 7 kids. She's actually pregnant at the 1848 women's rights convention held right here in Seneca Falls, and she comes out in public pregnant, and everyone's like appalled because pregnant women aren't supposed to go outside in 1848. They're not supposed to be seen in public if they're pregnant in 1848. Martha Coffin Wright knows Harriet Tubman very well. You might all know Harriet Tubman for her work in the Underground Railroad and also as a spy in the Civil War. So Martha Coffin Wright works for the Underground Railroad. She helps transport people escaping slavery into Canada, and she helps Harriet Tubman and other people who are working on the Underground Railroad. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, we talked a little bit about her already. So she's pretty privileged, and I think that's a word that gets thrown around now, like right now in our day and age, a lot, but that really is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She's born into a family where her mother is a Livingston of, as they say around here, of the New York Livingstons. Both of her grandfathers fought in the Revolutionary War. Her father, Daniel Cady, had been a representative to Congress. He was a New York State Supreme Court justice. He was a law professor. He was pretty wealthy. So she grew up, like the house she grew up in was like the nicest house in her town. Everybody knew her, everybody knew her family. When she was a young girl, she was like 9, she had a brother who had been sick and passed away. And her father was so distraught at the death of his child, as any parent would be, right? And Elizabeth, at 9 years old, went to her dad and she said that she would do everything she could to be the boy that her brother couldn't be. And she did. She learned how to ride horses with all the boys. She learned math better than all the boys. She learned Greek. She took all these classes in school that were usually only allowed for boys to take. And she did everything she could to prove to her father that she could do everything just as good as her brother would have done. So on July 9th, 1848, all 5 of these women come together at the house of Jane Hunt. So this is Jane Hunt's house. That's Jane Hunt down in the right-hand corner there. And Jane knows that Lucretia Mott is coming to town and she wants to invite her to tea. And so she invites Marianne, knowing that Marianne knows Lucretia, and she invites Martha because she knows that Martha is her sister, and Lucretia is actually staying with Martha. And of course she invites Elizabeth Cady Stanton because she knows that Elizabeth and Lucretia are also very good friends. So she invites all these 5 women are here having tea. And I always say, which might not make sense in Colorado, but it makes a lot of sense here. I always say they're not sitting around talking about how high the corn is, right? These women are talking about stuff that is very political. They're talking about things that really upset them. They're talking about things that that they want to see changed. So they're talking about things like, Martha Coffin Wright, who is determined enough to make her way back to New York after a shipwreck with her baby and saves other people, right? And we have Jane Hunt, who has this brilliant business mind, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who learns the law and math and all these other things along with all of the students that her father teaches. We have Lucretia Mott, who is probably the best known speaker of the time in the anti-slavery movement. And we have Marianne McClellan, who teaches young women, who started two important anti-slavery societies. And these women are sitting around and they are mad. And they're talking about things like, you know, Martha and Lucretia are talking about things like, why did my mother have to pay back the debt that my father incurred when she didn't have any rights to it when he was alive? That makes no sense. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is talking about, I learned everything I could learn that the boys learn. Why couldn't I go to college? She couldn't go to college. She wanted to go to college. She wanted to be a lawyer. She couldn't do that. They're talking about things like, why can't our daughters be educated in school the same way our sons are? Why do we have to educate them on the second floor of our house or on the second floor of our store? They're talking about things like, why, with Jane Hunt, like why don't women have the right to learn about how to run this business and be financially independent? Those are some of the things that they're talking about. And they're really mad. And so they decide to plan that convention that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott talked about way back in 1840. So like 8 years ago. And, you know, I always say, well, you know, life happens. It takes a little while to get things, to make things happen sometimes. You know, Lucretia Mott is out speaking about the anti-slavery movement, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton is, you know, a young mother and she's moving from place to place, and, you know, all these things are happening. And so they decide at that tea party that they're going to host this convention, and they're going to do it in 9 days. They're going to do it on the 19th. They're going to do it in 9 days because Lucretia Mott will still be there. And they think if they post in the newspaper, which is exactly what this is, it's the newspaper posting. If they post Lucretia Mott's name, that even if people aren't interested in women's rights, or they don't care, or they don't think that women, you know, should have rights, or they don't think that women's rights are any less than men's rights, they'll still come to hear Lucretia Mott because everybody knows her name. And everybody in the area would probably want to come and see her. And so what they do is they decide who else is going to come to this convention, and they write a document, and they base their document on the Declaration of Independence, and they call it the Declaration of Sentiments. It's set up exactly the same way as, it's set up exactly the same way as the Declaration of Independence. You might recognize this phrase, right? But the one thing they added was "and women." So we like to tell Independence National Historical Park in Philadelphia, where they wrote the Declaration of Independence. We like to tell them all the time, we fixed it for you. We fixed it for you. So all those things that they were talking about at that tea at Jane Hunt's house, they put in the list of grievances. So there's a list of grievances just like there is in the Declaration of Independence. And these are taken right from the Declaration of Sentiments. And these are all the things that they were complaining about, that they were upset with, and they were fed up. That's a good word, fed up, or 2 words, right? So these are all the things that they want to fight for. So the other thing that I said that they did was they invited, they decided to invite some people to the convention. So who else is going to come? And they decided to invite Frederick Douglass. And you might know who Frederick Douglass is. He is one of our nation's leading speakers, or what we would call in history, he's an orator, and he, you know, is just, that's what he does. He writes books and he speaks in public. And Elizabeth McClintock, Marianne McClintock's daughter, invites him. And this is a copy of the actual letter that he sent back, saying that he will absolutely come. And he was already invited by Lucretia Mott. So he was really excited to come, and he does. So on the 19th of July, 172 years ago, they all gathered in the Wesleyan Chapel, and this is what the Wesleyan Chapel looks like today. And they gathered in here. 300 women and men came, 200 women and 100 men. And they stood up. Elizabeth Cady Stanton stands up and she starts to read the Declaration of Sentiments. So remember how it said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. So of course, as soon as she says that, you know, everybody in the place goes like, ooh. And then she gets to the part where she talks about women voting. So if you look back at this, right, it says the first right of a citizen, the elective franchise. So that's what she's talking about when she's talking about voting. She wants women to be equal to men as citizens. And when she says that, when she gets up and she reads that, there is no holding back from all of the people in the chapel at the time. It's just like a big uproar. And finally, so on the first day, the men are not supposed to participate. They decide that the men can participate on the second day, but not on the first, because this is what they learned from London. So Frederick Douglass stands up when they're going through all this and everybody's yelling, women shouldn't have the right to vote. And even the other 4 women who wrote the Declaration of Sentiments, who planned this convention, who were at that tea, disagreed with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She insisted that voting be entered into the Declaration of Sentiments, and most of the people in this building also disagreed with her. So Frederick Douglass stood up and he said, essentially, he asked to stand and speak, and they said yes. And what he says is that essentially, if you want the right to an education, if you want the right to own and inherit property, if you want the rights to custody of your children, if you want the right to your own wages, if you want the rights to your own career, you are not going to get and keep any of those if you do not have the right to vote. And that started the whole conversation about women having the right to vote in this country. It actually started that conversation about women having the right to vote in the whole world. One of the things that Frederick Douglass says is that we have to demand the rights that we want. And this is one of my favorite quotes ever. So power concedes nothing without a demand. So that means that the people in power are never going to just give you what you want. You have to fight for it. And we see a lot of that happening in our nation today. So thank you. I think I'm kind of running over time here. I think we can start, I don't know where Amy is, but I think we can start questions in the chat.
Yeah, so thank you. That was super informative. I know I even learned quite a bit that I had
I'm so glad.
before. It was really quite interesting. So thank you so much, Ranger Denise. We are now, we can now take questions. So I'm going to open up the chat box. So folks, anything that you enter into the chat box, all of us will be able to see, but I'll go ahead and read the questions out loud, and then Ranger Denise will answer them for us. So let the questions start rolling in. I guess maybe, so could you maybe, Ranger Denise, tell us a little bit about your role at the park and kind
Absolutely.
of job and your day-to-day?
Yeah, I am the education specialist here. So I create all of the programs that we do with students. So when we have field trips and Girl Scout groups come in, all of the programs that that we do with students, I create. And so right now I'm spending a lot of time creating a lot of programs that teachers can offer to students virtually. And I'm spending a lot of time creating some individual learner programs so that anyone who wants to learn about it, or we have some students this year especially who are going to be homeschooled or in a homeschool group, that they would be able to access those programs and those kind of, I don't want to call them a lesson, but I guess it's kind of a lesson.
Learning opportunity.
Learning opportunities. So we have opportunities for classes, you know, for whole groups, and we have learning opportunities for individuals, and so that anyone can access those, and that they would be hopefully spark some interest and some learning on the part of people.
Great. So one question came in, and Izzy asks, what role did Susan B. Anthony play in the women's rights movement?
So Susan B. Anthony comes to Seneca Falls in 1851 at the invitation of Amelia Bloomer. Amelia Bloomer, you might already know, but in case you don't, she is the woman who made pants popular. So she wore this outfit that was, you know, just sent all the neighbors tizzy, and it had, so the skirt, instead of the skirt in her time, right? So in the 1840s, women's skirts went all the way to the floor, and they were pretty big, right? So Amelia Bloomer cut her skirt just below her knee, and she wore what were called bloomers underneath, but now we would just call them like kind of wide leg pants, maybe with like an elastic around the knee area. So that's kind of what it looked like. So if you have any interest in looking her up, you can. So she was a friend of Amelia Bloomer's, and Amelia Bloomer invited her to Seneca Falls and introduced her to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And there's a pretty famous statue in Seneca Falls to commemorate that meeting, because you might know Susan B. Anthony is a really prominent fighter for women's rights, especially in the early movement. She unfortunately passes away before women have the right to vote, but she tries to vote in 1872, and she gets arrested, and she has to go to court. So she's pretty, yeah, she's pretty cool. The relationship between Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony is that we all know Susan B. Anthony's name, or a lot of us know Susan B. Anthony's name, because she's the one who gave the speeches, right? But Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote those speeches. And Susan would come here to Elizabeth's house, and Susan would lock Elizabeth in a room and tell her she couldn't come out until she had a speech. Yeah, a good speech. The next one had to be really good, and you can't come out until it's done. So it's kind of like your mom making, or your dad making you do your homework, right? My dad used to have to do that with me with my math homework. But that's what it was like. And so Elizabeth had 7 children, and so she wasn't, when they were young, she wasn't able to go out and and say all these speeches herself. And the truth is she didn't really want to, but Susan did. And Susan was really charismatic and really good at expressing all of those things that Elizabeth wrote. And they worked hand in hand for more than 50 years.
Wow.
To push the women's movement along.
I always find that so interesting. You know, sometimes you can be really passionate about something and not always feel comfortable kind of speaking out about it. So I think it's wonderful to find people who are equally passionate about things, and the importance of, you know, like charisma and public speaking skills are really important and to advocate for issues that you believe in.
Absolutely.
So Camden asked, what got you interested in this topic, and what is your favorite fact about the women's suffrage movement? That's a good question.
That's a very good question. So, I was a brownie. So you all know, I was a brownie and I was a Girl Scout for 1 year. But in that time, I also have 4 brothers. There was at one point when I was in brownies, that I think I was in the 3rd grade, that my brothers wouldn't let me play football with them. And I was really mad. Just like those 5 women were at that tea party, right? And I was really mad. And so all of the girls on my street were also in our brownies and Girl Scout troops. And so I complained to them, just like all the women complained at the tea party, right? And I said, this is so not fair. I don't understand why we can't play football. And so we made signs, and we walked up and down our street holding our signs because we were really mad that they wouldn't let us play football. And so we protested. And that was the first protest well, it actually wasn't. I went to another protest when I was a little baby with my dad. But that was the first protest that I organized. And that's really what got me involved in women's rights and what women were allowed to do and not allowed to do. And it started when I was in the 3rd grade. My favorite fact about the 1848 convention and the women's rights movement is probably how connected the 2 movements are. So I know that's kind of a big fact, but the way all of these women all worked really hard in the anti-slavery and abolition movements and in the Underground Railroad, and how easily that flowed, and the organization of that flowed into creating this movement for women, rights that women have, or don't have.
Okay, so we are running up against our hour here, but let me go through. There's lots of questions and comments in the chat box. We have the chat box closed up again.
Okay.
Just people commenting about they didn't realize how restrictive things were for women. And I know for me, I think the biggest thing that I'm taking away from today's session is what Frederick Douglass said, that if you want all of these other things, you can't have them without the right to vote as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I thought that was such a great way to wrap everything up. So I thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So there's, questions here about like, how did women get their food and kind of what life was like in this time. So girls, I encourage you to kind of go out and do some research on that yourselves.
So I just want to say, Izzy.
Yeah.
She didn't really lock her in her room. I was being a little facetious, but she would tell her that, she couldn't go and do anything else until that was done. Essentially the same as, making sure when you're adults, make sure you get your homework done. Same kind of thing. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Amy. But
not a worry. And girls, you probably should all know that a lot of politicians out there and activists today have speechwriters that work for them. So it's definitely not unheard of at all.
Correct.
Okay, so I think we answered most of the questions that are in the chat box. And so I have one final question for you. But before get to that question. I just want to remind girls that you can go out and earn the 2 different patches to recognize this important moment in history and continue learning about this moment in history. I think it's wonderful that we, got up to the convention, and there's a lot more to learn about from there. So I definitely encourage all your learning. I will send out an email to everyone after this with links to those, to where you can find information about those patches. So I'm going to wrap things up. We've been doing something called a Meet an Expert series. I'm here with Girl Scouts of Colorado, where we get to meet women in all different career paths. So even though this wasn't a specific Meet an Expert session, I'm going to ask you the final question I ask all of our experts that we engage with, and that would be, what is your favorite Girl Scout cookie?
Oh, just one?
Or you could say 2.
Okay, just 2. I should say that. I actually really loved the new ones this year. I liked those a lot.
Great.
I am crazed for Samoas. I love I love the what's it called? The peanut butter
or the sandwiches.
Tagalongs.
Those are the peanut butter and chocolate ones, and do-si-do.
I love those. Oh my God! But then the regular peanut butter sandwich. Oh yeah, I love them all. I tell you how much money I spend in Girl Scout cookies every year.
I mean, you're talking to the right crowd. So
I am. I really am. But I really do. I wish that was an exaggeration. It is not.
I love it. Well, again, thank you so much, Ranger Denise. We learned a lot today. We're going to definitely be pointing girls to the recording of this online so they can continue learning. And thank you to all the Girl Scouts out there in Colorado and beyond for listening in today. I hope you found this as interesting as I did. So
thank you so much, everybody. It was
have a great day.
Thank you.